Hello, class. Steve Strand here. Today we're going to talk about intangible assets. And I have an outline here for you. And I'm going to be writing some things as we go. So hopefully you can make some notes yourself or print this off afterwards and use for your notes. These are in 15-minute segments, so there's a couple of these. So let's get started, see how this works. First of all, with intangible assets, I want to say that these are non-current assets. We've been talking about non-current assets previously. We talked about machinery, equipment, land, buildings, vehicles. Those types of assets are listed in a separate category on the balance sheet under the non-current asset section. And those assets that I just mentioned that we've been talking about are referred to oftentimes as either tangible assets. Tangible means you can touch them, you can see them, they have a physical presence. And sometimes they're referred to as a property, plant, and equipment. Property meaning land and buildings. Plant means building. Equipment, what it sounds like, machinery, equipment, vehicles, furniture, etc. So we're going to turn our attention to intangible assets in today's lecture. So intangible assets, as you can see on the outline here, they're presented, how they're presented is they are listed on the asset section of the balance sheet, something we own, future benefit, and it's listed under the non-current asset section because we expect to have these intangible assets for longer than the next 12 months. So let's talk about some characteristics of intangible assets. First of all, as I mentioned, they lack physical presence. So they're not like machinery and equipment and buildings, etc. Number two is they are not financial instruments, i.e., meaning they're not cash, they're not investments, they're not accounts receivable, etc. So when we talk about the valuation of intangible assets, we're going to adhere to the cost principle. which is the same principle we talked about for tangible assets. The cost principle means that we're going to account for assuming I can spell here, account for these assets at their cost. And we don't care about any other value, fair market value, tax value, liquidation value. We don't care about any of those other values. We care about what the asset cost us. Okay, so we're going to account for these assets at what they cost us. There are two major identifiable types of intangible assets I want to mention that's going to be important for us. One are intangible assets that have a limited life. That means that these assets have either a legal life in years or a useful life also in years. And we're going to consider the shorter of either life when we calculate an expense associated with these intangible assets. So keep in mind, they can have a legal life and they can have a useful life, and we're going to use the shorter of either lives when we calculate an expense. That's coming up. And there's also then unlimited life intangible assets. And for these unlimited life intangible assets, there is no expense calculation done because, as you'll see in a little bit, like we did with tangible assets, we're going to recognize an expense over the life of this intangible asset. And if there is no identifiable life, either legal life or useful life, then we can't calculate an expense. There's no years, there's no life to calculate that expense over. Okay, I'm going to talk about some categories of intangible assets, and then I'll go back and give you some examples. By the way, I have to say, first of all, it's strange doing a lecture without looking out and seeing those smiling little faces of yours. And secondly, what's really weird is when I pause and play back what I've recorded already, I say to myself, do I really sound like that? I mean, is that what I sound like? I mean, I pictured myself having this deep sort of broadcast voice, like a movie star type of thing. Instead, I sound more like, like Winnie the Pooh or something. So it's embarrassing. Anyway, when you're done laughing, we'll continue to talk about categories of intangibles, and I'll get to some examples in a minute because these little YouTube segments are 15 minutes long, and I'm going to run out of time trying to do some examples. So let's talk about some categories. There are marketing-related intangibles. Again, I'll do some examples later. There are customer-related intangibles. There are artistic-related intangible assets. There are contract-related intangible assets. And there are technology-related intangible assets. And later on, we're going to talk about two special categories of intangible assets. Whoops, that's telling me that's an E for category, not an A. And that is goodwill and research and development. We'll talk about that later. Let me spell research right. Okay, so these are all different categories of intangible assets. When we come back in the next little 15-minute segment, I'll give you some examples within these categories, and then we'll talk about how to calculate an expense and what that expense is called, and also how to account for the expense using the balance sheet equation. So, hope you're still awake, and see you in the next segment. Thanks. So I can see that I have a minute and 45 seconds here or so before this segment is done with. So I'm just going to mention something in general, that the theory of an expense with intangibles, the same theory as an expense with tangibles. Tangibles expense was referred to as depreciation expense. Intangibles expense is referred to as amortization expense. The theory is the same. You're going to see the calculation is very similar, but tangibles, machinery, equipment, buildings, vehicles, etc., is called depreciation expense, as we saw earlier, and the expense associated with intangibles is referred to as amortization expense.